New emails today show Jeremy Corbyn aides plan to influence the party's panel. Emails obtained by Sky News relate to a discussion about the makeup of a panel due to hear cases related to anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn's top aide instructed party officials to compile a dossier setting out how Labour's highest disciplinary body could be challenged. Leaked emails have revealed Mr Corbyn's chief of staff, Carrie Murphy, said it was absurd the National Constitutional Committee, which operates independently of the party's governing body, was able to overrule concerns raised by the leadership.
Well, what's happening is it's an institutional infight. Many of the people who were put in positions of authority in the Labour Party as paid officials during the Blair era were very super pro-Israel. They just were. And if you look at all these people who are banging on about anti-Semitism, you actually look at their voting record, they all voted in favour of the war in Iraq, for example, like Margaret Hodge. So in other words, these people are not independent in their views.
I'll put a link up to this story on our show page. A Jewish group claimed the emails show the party's leadership want to interfere over anti-Semitism cases and are not prepared to let the NCC be independent.
Well, a political party doesn't have to have independent people looking into it. At one stage, the Board of Deputies of British Jews are saying they wanted to appoint an ombudsman to look into the Labour Party and decide who was and who was not anti-Semitic. Now, these people are basically Tory voters, and they're insisting that they can have somebody that decides what the Labour Party can and can't do. Ultimately, this is about politics. The state of Israel is in flagrant violation of international law. If they were called Serbia, we would already bomb them. But they're called Israel, so we basically have to kowtow to them. It can't go on. It can't go on.
So anyway, earlier this week I spoke to Anton Chaitkin, and his father was involved in the American Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany back in the 1930s. And I asked him what he made of Labour and the anti-Semitism row.
You can have a laugh at some of this, because if you examine the attacks against Mr. Corbyn, Labour Party leader, on this account that his faction is anti-Semitic, these attacks emanate from institutions and billionaires associated with the City of London and the offshore system. I've looked into this quite a bit. You have the same kind of thing that goes back to the original problem in the 1930s. My father, Jacob Chaitkin, was the legal director and strategist for the boycott against Nazi Germany carried out by the American Jewish Congress and the American Federation of Labor. This boycott against Hitler was before Hitler had really a big army to start a war, but he was in power. And that boycott was opposed by the leading Jewish bank in Wall Street, the Kuhn Loeb, and their organization, the American Jewish Committee. They were intensely loyal to the British system and to the international system that at that time was promoting Hitler and Mussolini. And they held press conferences in New York to denounce the boycott against Hitler Germany. That was in 1933. My father was an FDR Democrat. And thank God we had FDR to stand up to Wall Street and to force Churchill. I mean, Churchill and the British stood up to bombing, but Churchill and his faction wanted to keep the war going on forever. They didn't want to overthrow Hitlerism. They wanted to have a war that would be perpetual. And we finally were able to invade France, and together with the Russians and with the bravery of the forces, including the British and everybody else that was on our side, and the Chinese, we won that war. But the war continued after that. I don't think World War II was ever concluded. That's the problem. We've got to bring that to an end and go and simply say that the alliance that we had in World War II to fight fascism should be resumed and enhanced. We should have the friendship between the great powers, all the great powers, to preserve civilization and take it further. Civilization is worth saving, despite radical environmentalism, despite whatever atheistic doctrines can be brought up now. Civilization is precious, and it's something we ought to acquaint our children with and work with between the great powers to solve our problems, including solving things like terrorism. We don't need wars to do that. The wars are causing the terrorism, not solving them. We need, for example, you want to solve the ISIS problem, have the great powers send their troops into the banks in Saudi Arabia and London and shut down the bank accounts, shut down the drug supply for the people on amphetamines carrying out these terrorist operations in Syria, and make peace with we have no real enemies of nations. No nation is our enemy. Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, all the ones that are talked about in Washington, or that Washington is pushed to go against from London. It's insane. All the nations have the same interest, and that is to have a future with an industry, science, and high skills and high wages that come from those things.
That's Anton Chaitkin there speaking to me earlier this week. Martin, I mean, he's really implying there that World War II never ended. He's saying that actually we have now got together with a fascist faction, which were the Nazis in the Second World War, to carry on the fight against Russia.
Well, as you know, Tony, a lot of top Nazis were integrated into NATO's intelligence structure from the get-go. Reinhard Gehlen, the former head of the Gestapo in Eastern Europe, became the head of the West German intelligence services after the war.
And what about what he was saying there about the bank Kuhn Loeb and the American Jewish Committee that the bank ran and controlled and funded versus the American Jewish Congress and the Federation of American Labour that his father was involved in that constructed the boycott against Hitler in 1933?
Well, that's right. And of course, the main group that one of the groups that collaborated with Hitler were the Zionists, who were a tiny minority in the world Jewish community, but they wanted the same thing as Hitler wanted. They wanted the Jews out of Germany. They wanted them in Israel, and there was a scoping meeting where a top Zionist activist and a SS colonel went to what was then British Mandate Palestine to look at the possibility of German Jews going there, and there was a medal struck with the Star of David on one side and a swastika on the other.
What was the American Jewish Committee doing supporting Hitler and Mussolini in the 30s then?
Well, don't forget that the oligarchy all over the world supported Hitler and Mussolini because they smashed the communists and prevented the possibility of any kind of socialist development out of the economic crisis of the 1930s. And, just as, some Jews are wealthy billionaires, and they sided with the other wealthy billionaires to support to keep Hitler and Mussolini going as a means of smashing their political opponents on the left.
Representing the entire city, this is BCFM. BCFM 93.2.
We finished this evening by having a listen to Catherine Austin Fitz. She is comparing here African and modern slavery and is really concerned about the move towards keeping all our money in little microchips.
If you look at where the currency system is going, you have an effort to develop digital currencies that will be far more conducive of surveillance, invasion, and I think of even chipping people. Tim Wu wrote a fantastic book that I'm always recommending. It's one of the best books for 2018 in the annual wrap-up, and it's called The Master Switch, and he describes the history of information technology, where there's a period of blossoming and innovation, and then, bam, it's used to centralize. And on each process of centralization, the central control grows. Mm-hmm. And my concern about what's next in terms of next in terms of currencies is I think where the leadership wants to go is they basically want to be able to collateralize a human being. So if I can integrate digital technology into you, then I can track you and I can use you as collateral. And you're back. Collateral. Okay, so let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. One of the books that most profoundly affected me over the last 2 years was a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. It's a history of the economics of the American slave trade. Mm-hmm. And there were two things in it that really stunned me. One was the slave population built up on the East Coast, And they decided, as it built up, to create 3 large corporations, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, to really build a cotton juggernaut. And they had a mass migration of slaves into those plantations. And one of the things they stipulated was that 70% should be single males between the ages of 17 and 35. And when I was reading the book, I was also doing an interview of someone about the European immigration situation, and I went to the EU website, and they noted that on all the immigrants that had come into Europe and also Germany that year, 70% were single males between 17 and 35.
Oh.
And I said, apparently it's the same playbook. It hasn't changed. That was number one. The second thing was there were 2 reasons why they canceled the slave trade. And one of them was that the banks in London kept losing money because every time commodity prices would drop, the plantation owners would sell the slaves west, and there was no way for the banks to prove that slave belonged to them. So there was no way to perfect a lien. There was no way to collateralize. If you can integrate digital technology into humans physically, suddenly you can. And that is a huge change. I think there is a tremendous effort underway to encourage people to accept wearing chips, integrating chips into their body. And the reality is, as soon as you can do that, you can use a human being to collateralize a loan. And then you're talking about taking away one of the primary reasons why they canceled the slave trade.
Well, fascinating little tidbit there from Catherine Austin Fitz, Martin.
Yeah, I've just been reading a book about the cotton industry and the history of it in the 19th century, and of course the plantations were worthless without the slaves. So the slaves were definitely, the banks would lend to plantation owners.
So are the banks taking us back via a vicarious route to the slave days?
Well.
I mean, they talk about wage slavery, don't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, the powerful have always tried to use any methods they can to keep the poor at their mercy.
OK, time to sign off for the US-owned Comcast News at 8. Thanks to our guest in the first hour, Lib Dem prospective parliamentary candidate for Bristol West, James Cox. You'll find this show's podcast story links comment page and our contact details at this week. One word. .org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. Our sister show Dialects here next Tuesday at noon. We go to Glastonbury. Do please join us for the politics show at 6 o'clock next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
Live from the Sky News Centre.